So tonight, we're going to turn our attention to an episode that happens in the Gospel of Luke. And I want to set the stage for you a little bit. In chapter 9, at the 51st verse, Luke makes a shift, and it's a very intentional shift. And what he tells us at that point is that Jesus, essentially knowing what was coming, at this point in his ministry and in his life, sets his face to go to Jerusalem. And Luke, unlike any of the other Gospels, takes the next 10 chapters to focus on Jesus being focused on heading toward Jerusalem. And his last time there, and you all know what happens then, when he gets to Jerusalem, that is when he is then imprisoned and beaten and crucified. But for 10 chapters, Jesus is focused. His face is set to go to Jerusalem. And every now and then, in these 10 chapters, Luke will remind us of that. He'll say, now remember, Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem. So all of the events that are happening are within that context. He is driven by a very particular purpose and focus of his life and ministry at that point. So within that context, just a few verses after we hear Luke start this section of his gospel, we get to a section where some would-be followers come to Jesus, and we hear the exchange that Jesus has with them. So hear these words now, beginning with verse 57. If you'd like to read along, you'll find it printed in your bulletin. As Jesus and his disciples traveled along the road, someone said to him, I will follow you wherever you go. Jesus replied, foxes have dens, and the birds in the sky have nests, but the human one, speaking about himself, has no place to lay his head. Then Jesus said to someone else, follow me. And he replied, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. Jesus said to him, let the dead bury their own dead, but you go and spread the news of God's kingdom. Someone else said to Jesus, I will follow you, Lord, but first let me say goodbye to those in my house. And Jesus said to him, no one who puts a hand on the plow and looks back is fit for God's kingdom. This is the word of God for the people of God, and God's people say, thanks be to God. In the year 1519, Hernan Cortez left the shore of Cuba with 500 men and 11 ships and set sail for Mexico. Now, Cortez actually wasn't supposed to make that mission. He was basically under mutiny at the time, or in mutiny against his commanding officer. But that aside, Cortez set sail for Mexico with 500 men and 11 ships in the year 1519. And he ultimately lands in an area that is known as Veracruz, or was known as Veracruz. And shortly after landing, Cortez has the sense, as some other commanders have over the centuries, there's some other similar stories of this happening. Cortez worried that some of the men might become afraid and decide that they want to take one or more of the ships back to where they came from and retreat. Cortez issues the command, most think, although some historians say that maybe it wasn't burn the ships, but the familiar phrasing of it is burn the ships, so that there would be no way to go back. They were there to stay, and they would either accomplish their mission or they would die, but they would not have the option to go back to the safety net or retreat to where they came from as one possibility. So this idea of burn the ships has become a phrase that gets used to talk about that idea of staying focused on what is ahead and refusing to look back or behind. It's this kind of outlook that we see chapter 9 of Luke and in the words that Jesus has to offer in the gospel tonight. Jesus, as I mentioned earlier, is clearly focused on what is in front of him, and he knows that the journey ahead for him will not be an easy one. And he knows that it will not be easy for anybody who chooses to make that journey with him either. And so in this particular scene, when some people inquire about following him, he has some pretty astounding words in response for them. But before we get to those and look at the context and look at what Jesus is saying in tonight's passage, let's take a look at the three prospective followers that we have tonight. The three who come to Jesus in this interchange in chapter 9 and in one way or another express an interest in following Jesus, but perhaps not so much after he shares what he has to share. So the first prospective follower that we have tonight that I'm going to introduce to you is the one that I will call the groupie. And the groupie is the one who is starstruck by Jesus. He has heard about Jesus, maybe he has seen Jesus perform some miracles, and he is so excited about this new guy on the scene, and so he is with rose-colored glasses and eager to say, Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go. Wherever your tour bus is going next, I'm going to be right behind it, and when you get there, I'm going to be in the front row for the performance every night because you are awesome. So that's number one. The one who quickly and spontaneously says, Jesus, I'll go wherever you go. Not fully understanding what it is that he's saying. The second prospective follower is the one that I'll refer to as the Boy Scout. Some of you know the Scout Oath, right? I will do my best, right? All my honor, I will do my best to do my duty. The second one is the Boy Scout. He recognizes a desire to follow Jesus, but he also, in this particular moment, has an obligation to fulfill. As an honorable and a loyal son, it is right and responsible for him to take care of his father's burial. And so he comes before Jesus as the Boy Scout, the one who will take the responsible role as the son and do the right religious obligatory thing in the moment. And then there's the third one. And the third prospective follower is the one that I'll refer to as the homebody. And this is the one who, when they were growing up and they went to camp, they needed to make sure they got a letter every day from home to make sure they felt comfortable for the whole week at camp. And they were the one who tried to convince the counselor to let them use the phone to call back home at night when they were feeling a little bit uncomfortable or unsure or scared. They love being close to home, and family is important. And family is where they want to spend their time. So we have the groupie, and we have the Boy Scout, and we have the homebody. And none of these three characters or their inclinations or desires are bad in and of themselves. But there is an exchange that is happening here tonight in the passage that is important for us to pay attention to. And it's always important for us to remember the verse that has preceded it, the one that I mentioned that comes at Luke 9:51. Jesus has set his face to go to Jerusalem. And what he knows is that anyone that is going to be a follower and be a disciple and go with him must also set their face for what is in front. And so the groupie's rose-colored enthusiasm may quickly get squashed by the harsh realities of having to sometimes be homeless, because Jesus doesn't always receive a welcome reception in some of the towns. In fact, just before this scene, that has happened in Samaria. So the groupie may become disillusioned and decide that maybe following isn't what he wants to do after all. The responsible scout, the one who wants to make sure he takes care of the obligation of caring for his father, which seems certainly like a noble and understandable thing to do. What Jesus notices and sees is that sometimes religion and a sense of religious obligation can cause one to lose sight of where Jesus is trying to lead us. And then the homebody, the one who loves the comfort of home, is the one who Jesus knows might be tempted in those tough moments, those tough times, to look back over his shoulder, longing for what was, and will he be able to hang in? So Jesus' words in this section tonight, his invitation, is not necessarily to say to them that what they want or what they desire is bad in any way, but it is the recognition that in order to be a follower of Jesus, it will require a complete realignment of one's sense of things. It is to see everything in light of the mission, which is to be consumed by the love of God and to be compelled to share that love with others. Everything, one's understanding of who Jesus is and what his mission is, one's sense of religious obligation, one's understanding even about one's relationship within one's own family, must be viewed, Jesus is saying, in light of the mission of being consumed by the love of God and compelled to share it with others. Now we see how critical this is when we get to the next scene, because at the beginning of chapter 10, Jesus commissions 70 followers, so 70 people who apparently have said, yes, I'm in, and sends them out in pairs into the harvest. And maybe you remember those words that Jesus says, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few, therefore send out laborers into the harvest. And so Jesus sends those 70 out into that harvest, knowing that they must keep now that their hands are on the plow, they must stay focused forward and not look back and regret the decision that they have made. And then what we hear a few verses later is the disciples coming back, excited to share with Jesus what they had encountered by being on mission with him. They come back having gone out into the towns and the cities and done exactly what he asked. And when they come back to Jesus, they say, wow, Jesus, you will not believe what has happened. And I imagine the joy that must have been on Jesus' face as they came back eager to tell him about their experiences, having gotten caught up in the mission that was his and that now is theirs as well. In the year 1994, Catherine and I were living in Tallahassee, Florida, and she at the time was the associate pastor at St. Paul's United Methodist Church, and I was serving as the youth director at the church. And I was in a season of my life where I had decided I had a really good compromise for God, and that whereas I had heard a number of years earlier a clear call into ordained ministry, that I had decided I would tell God that the way I would live that out would be as a teacher and as a coach. And that after all, that was a great compliment to my wife being an ordained minister who would be under the itinerant system within the Methodist Church. And so wherever she was appointed, I could go and teach and could coach. And so I was enjoying this season of life, and I was working with kids, and I was finishing up my degree in education at that point. And that year, the year 1994, a song came out by somebody who was probably my favorite contemporary Christian artist at the time, Stephen Curtis Chapman. And the title of the song was Burn the Ships. And the first verse of the song was based on this story of Cortez going to Mexico. But then when you get to the second verse, it kind of flips, and he uses that as an analogy for talking about the life of discipleship. Burn the ships, because there's no going back. Well, it wasn't long after I first heard this song and started listening to it and the whole album that it was a part of, that I had some high school youth and some college students that I had developed relationships with and gotten to know, and who I sensed might have a call into some kind of ministry. And so it just so happened that the United Methodist Church had started offering something called Exploration, a national event where young people could go and could hear from speakers about the call into ministry, and could also spend time in small groups with each other and share what they were thinking and feeling and where God might be leading them in their lives. So I thought, what a great idea. I can take 17 to 20-something or 22-year-olds to this event at such a key time in their life so that they can have an opportunity to listen for whether or not God may be calling them into ministry. So we loaded up the van and we went to Richmond, Virginia, and we made that trip. And on the first night, as I was eager for them to have their experience of God's calling on their lives, and I was still quite content to be working my compromise with God, I came to grips with my own call. It was with those young people, the 30-year-old at the time finally came to terms with the fact that I was called. And that it was time for me to finally burn whatever ships it was that were keeping me from being all in for a lifetime in ordained ministry. Over the last 25 years, one of the greatest things for me has been the opportunity to have moments when I could come back from experiences in ministry and say, wow, Jesus, you won't believe what happened. This passage and this story also makes me think of Oliver. Oliver is a young man that Catherine and I met 3 years ago at the Greenbow House of Prayer. It's a retreat center that is up in South Georgia. You wouldn't know it was there unless you knew it was there. It is in the middle of nowhere, and it is a quiet place where we go to be quiet and to listen and to hopefully hear something. And Oliver, for the last 3 years, for the last 4 years now actually, because he'd been there for a while before we first met him there, Oliver has been living there as what is known as a novice. There are 2 persons who live there at Greenbow who have committed themselves to the monastic life and to the stability of living in that place for the rest of their lives. And Oliver has been there for the last 4 years now, contemplating whether that will be his life. Oliver came there having gone to college and gone to graduate school and having had a successful consulting practice in engineering in the Atlanta area, but never felt satisfied, never felt like he was fully living into what it was that God had for his life. And you know, there are lots of ways that we can live into what it is that God has for our lives. But whatever it is, it's a really good idea to be paying attention when God is trying to get our attention and to listen. And so Oliver was listening. And Oliver went to Greenbow. And now for 4 years has been in this process of contemplating and discerning. And this summer, he'll be making his decision about whether he will join them in that monastic life for good, for life, and make that his place of residence. I invite your prayers for Oliver, but I'm inspired by Oliver's story and the way he has paid attention and is thinking now what it might mean for him to burn the ships. So what about you? What about you? What ships might you need to burn in order to be all in for whatever it is that God might want to do with your life? What is it that's holding you back? What ship is it that maybe represents that safety net, that place of retreat, that place of longing where when things might get tough, you could go, oh, well, I'll just go back to that. That's safe. That's comfortable. What ships might you need to burn in order to be all in order to set your face to go with Jesus wherever it is that Jesus wants to take you? And if you did burn those ships, if you were all in, what stories might emerge from your life that would cause you to say, wow, Jesus, you won't believe what just happened? John Wesley was fond of a prayer that helped him, I think that helped remind him of the fact that he had burned the ships and had committed himself to the way of discipleship and the way of following. And so this was a prayer that he would use every year as a part of a watch night service as one year went into the next. A way to start the new year remembering, I am all in. So tonight, in closing, I want to read this prayer. And I'll read it in first person, but invite you to hear it, and if you desire to claim it as your own as well. So let me invite you to pray with me. I am no longer my own, but thine. Put me to what thou wilt, rank me with whom thou wilt. Put me to doing, put me to suffering. Let me be employed by thee or laid aside for thee, exalted for thee or brought low for thee. Let me be full, let me be empty. Let me have all things, let me have nothing. I freely and heartily yield all things to thy pleasure and disposal. And now, O glorious and blessed God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, thou art mine and I am thine. So be it. And the covenant which I have made on earth, let it be ratified in heaven.